It began on a bitterly cold autumn evening when I returned to the old family cabin deep in the woods, a place that had long been abandoned and whispered about by locals as cursed. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, and as I drove up the winding gravel road, the silence was absolute except for the occasional creak of distant branches. I had inherited the cabin unexpectedly, and despite warnings from friends, I felt compelled to revisit it, hoping to reclaim some part of my past. Little did I know that my decision would open the door to horrors I could never have imagined. The cabin's exterior was shrouded in darkness as I stepped out of my car. The once proud, weathered wood was now stained by years of neglect, and the windows stared blankly like lifeless eyes. With a heavy heart and an inexplicable sense of dread, I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, dust motes danced in the faint beam of my flashlight, and the silence was broken only by the echo of my footsteps. The place was frozen in time, a relic of memories that felt both familiar and hauntingly alien. I set my bag down and decided to explore, unaware that every step I took awakened echoes of the past. In the main hall, the air felt unnaturally cold. I paused by an old portrait hanging crookedly on the wall, a stern, somber-faced woman whose eyes seemed to follow me. A chill slithered down my spine. I remembered that this was my great-grandmother, rumored to have dabbled in things beyond mortal understanding. The whispers began then, faint, almost imperceptible voices that I could have sworn were calling my name. I told myself it was just the wind filtering through broken windows, but the sound grew slowly into a murmur that echoed with both longing and malice. I settled in for the night, lighting a few candles in the parlor and making a small fire in the old stone hearth. As darkness deepened outside, the silence within the cabin was punctured by a sudden, shattering crash from upstairs. I jumped up, heart hammering, and crept towards the staircase. With each step, the wood groaned as though protesting my presence. At the top, the corridor was dark and narrow. I aimed my flashlight toward a door that had been closed all my life. My old room, untouched since childhood. I hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. Inside, the room was arranged as if frozen in time. My childhood bed lay covered in a dusty quilt, and my favorite toys sat in silent rows. But something was off. A mirror above the dresser reflected not only the room, but also a shadow lurking behind me. I spun around. Nothing was there. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Later that night, as I sat alone in the parlor, I began to hear a distinct scratching at the window. The sound was steady and deliberate, like fingernails scraping against glass. I drew closer, and in the murky darkness outside, I glimpsed a pale face, half hidden by tangled hair, staring in with sorrowful, accusing eyes. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a void of terror and unanswered questions. I scrambled to shut the window, my hands trembling, but the image burned into my mind. Over the next few days, the cabin revealed more of its sinister secrets. I discovered a hidden journal tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace. The diary belonged to my great-grandmother and detailed her desperate attempts to contact spirits from the other side. Her words were frantic, filled with desperation and regret. She wrote of a presence she had unwittingly invited into her home, a presence that now seemed to dwell within these very walls. The final entry ended abruptly with a single, blood-curdling scream recorded in her hurried scrawl. Reading those words, I felt as if her torment had seeped into my soul, and that I, too, had become entangled in a web of darkness. One stormy evening, as thunder rattled the windows and rain pounded the roof, I decided to document the strange events in hopes of understanding the haunting. I set up my camera in the parlor, determined to capture any anomalies. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and died, plunging the cabin into pitch darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a feeble beacon in the void. In that moment, the camera caught a glimpse, a fleeting shadow darting across the wall behind me. I turned sharply, heart in my throat, but found nothing except the oppressive black. Then came a whisper, a voice so soft and mournful it seemed to echo from deep within the cabin's walls. "Leave before it's too late." The sound sent a jolt through me, and I knew that whatever haunted this place was growing bolder. Desperation mingled with terror as the nights wore on. I began to see figures, ghostly shapes lingering in doorways, moving silently in the corners of my vision. One night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps pacing the hallway. I got up and crept toward the sound, each step measured and cautious. As I reached the end of the hall, my flashlight illuminated a figure standing by the doorway. A tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted, anguished expression. Before I could react, the figure vanished, leaving behind only a gust of freezing wind and the echo of a sorrowful cry. I retreated back to the safety of the parlor, my mind racing and my heart pounding like a war drum. I attempted to confront the haunting by calling out to the unseen presence. "Who are you?" I demanded into the darkness, voice trembling. For a moment, the silence was all that answered me. Then, from the depths of the corridor, a chorus of voices responded. Multiple voices, overlapping in a haunting cacophony. "We are here. We have always been here." The sound was overwhelming, a spectral choir of the damned that chilled me to the bone. The next few nights were a blur of terror and restless sleep. I would lie awake, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for the next jump scare. A door slamming shut unexpectedly, a mirror reflecting a face that wasn't mine or the feeling of cold, ghostly hands brushing against my skin. One night, as I sat in the living room reviewing the footage from my camera, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In a brief frame, I saw the reflection of a young girl standing behind me in the mirror. Her eyes were empty, and her expression was one of deep sorrow and accusation. I turned, but there was no one. I rewound the tape, desperate to understand, but the footage offered no explanation, only the haunting echo of her silent plea. In a final bid to break the cycle, I prepared a small ritual based on the journal's cryptic instructions, hoping to release the tortured souls bound to the cabin. With trembling hands, I lit candles in a circle in the main hall, recited the incantations I'd found, and begged for forgiveness on behalf of those who had been wronged, but the ritual I had prepared from my great-grandmother's journal was incomplete. The final pages of her instructions were missing, torn out or destroyed. Yet, I felt compelled to proceed, desperate to end the torment that had consumed my nights. The candles flickered as I recited the incantations, my voice trembling with fear and uncertainty. The air grew heavier with each word, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. Then, without warning, the flames extinguished themselves, plunging the room into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I strained to hear anything at all. But the void was suffocating. Suddenly, A low growl resonated from somewhere deep within the cabin, vibrating through the walls and floorboards. It wasn't human. It was primal, guttural, and filled with rage. I froze, clutching the journal tightly, as if it could protect me from whatever was lurking in the shadows. Then came the whispers again, this time louder, more insistent. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were chanting something in a language I couldn't understand. The voices seemed to come from every corner of the room, surrounding me in a cacophony of despair and malice. I stumbled backward, knocking over one of the candles. As it rolled across the floor, its faint glow revealed something in the corner. A figure crouched low, its limbs twisted unnaturally, and its face obscured by darkness. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot as the figure slowly rose to its full height. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an icy dread that made my breath hitch in my throat. The figure stepped closer, and as it emerged into the faint light of my flashlight, I saw its face, or what remained of it. Hollow eyes stared back at me from a skull-like visage, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to mock my fear. "Why have you come here?" It rasped, its voice like nails scraping against stone. I didn't mean to disturb you," I stammered, barely able to form words. "You are part of this now," it said, stepping closer until it was mere inches away. "You cannot leave." Suddenly, the room erupted into chaos. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe as shadows danced wildly across them. The whispers grew louder and more frenzied, overlapping into a maddening chorus that drowned out my thoughts. Objects flew off shelves and crashed to the floor. Windows shattered despite there being no wind outside. The cabin itself seemed alive, a malevolent force determined to consume me. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The figure laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through every fiber of my being. "You cannot escape," it said again, its voice reverberating through the walls. Desperate and terrified beyond reason, I turned back toward the circle of candles and grabbed one of them from the floor. Using its faint light as a guide, I searched frantically for anything that might help me complete the ritual. My great-grandmother's journal had mentioned something about binding the presence to an object, a mirror, but I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. The mirror, my childhood mirror, still hung above the dresser in my old room upstairs. The same mirror where I had seen shadows lurking behind me days earlier. With no other options left, I sprinted toward the staircase, dodging flying debris as I went. The growls and whispers followed me like a storm cloud, growing louder with each step. When I reached my old room and flung open the door, I found myself face to face with another figure. A young girl dressed in tattered clothing stained with dirt and blood. Her eyes were empty sockets that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Help us," she whispered softly before vanishing into thin air. I turned toward the mirror above the dresser and saw something horrifying. Dozens of faces pressed against its surface from within, screaming silently as they clawed at the glass. Their expressions were twisted with agony and desperation. They were trapped souls begging for release, summoning every ounce of courage I'd left. I raised one of the candles to illuminate their faces fully and began reciting what little of my great-grandmother's incantation I could remember. "Bound by flesh, bound by soul, release thy grip, let darkness go." The faces inside the mirror began to writhe and contort violently, as if fighting against some unseen force. The growls behind me grew louder, closer, and suddenly something cold wrapped around my ankle. a hand emerging from beneath the floorboards. I screamed and kicked at it desperately, while continuing to recite the incantation over and over again. Bound by flesh, bound by soul. The hand tightened its grip until pain shot through my leg like fire. But then came a blinding flash of light from within the mirror itself. The faces inside let out one final scream before disappearing entirely. And with them went every sound in the cabin. The oppressive weight lifted instantly. Everything fell silent except for my ragged breathing as I collapsed onto the floor in exhaustion. But relief was short-lived as I looked back toward the mirror one last time before leaving that cursed place forever. I saw my own reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't mine anymore. It smiled and whispered, "You're ours now." I fled that night, but never truly escaped, because wherever I go now, they follow,